Hi everybody, it's Maureen of Maureen 97 Designs, and I'm back with part 2 of our stamping on fabric to make pieces for hand stitching or machine stitching. So today's video I'm gonna actually go through the stamping with you, but first we need to actually put our stamps on something that we can stamp with, because they are just these clear stamps. You technically could just hold them in your hand, but you probably wouldn't get a very good impression. So you're going to want acrylic blocks, and you want acrylic blocks because first of all the stamp will stick to the acrylic, and also because you can see through it to see where exactly you're stamping. The one thing about these stamps is, because I didn't want little and fiddly, a lot of the stamps are really big, and I don't have blocks big enough to use with those bigger size stamps. And actually, even if I had really big acrylic blocks like this, I might not want to use them on these larger stamps, because it can be sometimes a little bit harder to make a good impression. So what these are stamping platforms, if you're not familiar with them. These are from the company My Sweet Petunia, and they're called Misties. And this is a mini Misty. This is the original size. They also have a memory Misty, which is 12 by 12, which I have, but I'm not going to use that today because I don't have any of the stamps that are that big that need the 12 by 12 size. But you can see, for example, my hexagon fits on this acrylic block, and I believe this is a 3 by 3 block, and my hexagon fit really nicely. And one of the tips is to line up the bottom line of the stamp kind of with the edge of your stamp block, because then you kind of know, even though you can see through it and see where you're stamping, sometimes you can still kind of not know exactly where it's going to stamp. But when you put it at the bottom edge like that, you know if you stamp near the bottom edge of the block, that's where your line is going to be. And then you can see this jewel shape did not fit on my acrylic block, and so I'm using my mini Misty for that. And one tip I want to give you about that is to have a piece of paper in your Misty and stamp down your stamp onto the paper, and that's going to give you a guide of where exactly the stamp is going to go, and so you know to position your fabric completely covering that image. I also want to show you another tip about mounting your stamps into your Misty, and I have another one here. Let me just move the magnet to the side. And I'm going to go in my folder, and let's just pick this 2-inch diamond. So normally how you place your stamps in the Misty is you place them face down, which is, this is the stamping edge, and you want to place that down in your Misty. Then you're going to close your door and pick up the stamp by just pressing it, and then it's in there. One thing though with these big stamps with this large amount of area in the middle that's not gonna stamp, you can trap air bubbles under there. So what I would do is just peel up half of the stamp to make sure the air bubbles come out, and then you just kind of walk your finger down that way to make sure the air bubbles are coming out. And then you can go ahead and lift up the other half and again walk your finger down and make sure that there are no air bubbles trapped underneath that stamp, because you can get ink onto that middle area and it can transfer onto your fabric. And although it's going to be on the back and it probably won't show, there's just no use for that extra ink on your fabric. So it's better if you just get all the air bubbles out right from the beginning. And then you can see I have my 3-inch diamond in my regular size Misty because it doesn't really fit in the mini. It kind of could, but I'm going to need to put my fabric there for stamping, so I wanted a little bit more room in my Misty to have my fabric placement. So let's start with the simplest. Okay, I forgot about inks. For my inks, I'm using Archival inks from Ranger, and they are acid-free, permanent, and waterproof. And that might seem kind of counterintuitive. You would think maybe you want your ink to actually wash out so that you won't be able to see it. Again, we're stamping on the back of the fabric. If you use something really dark on a lighter fabric, it might show through the front. So you want to kind of use an appropriate ink for your fabric. But the reason why we don't want it to wash out is because you don't want all of that ink in your wash water when you're washing your item. There's a chance that if you use a darker ink, it could actually stain other parts of your quilt or your piece, and you don't want that. So you actually want the permanent ink to make sure that it doesn't wash out of your quilt. And I have just a few here. I have a collection of these from when I was a stamper, making cards, and I would try to use something that is darker than whatever fabric I'm using, but not too much darker. Just dark enough that I can see it so I can cut it out and stitch with it. Okay, then I have some fabric here, and you can see it's got some really dark areas in the flowers here, some kind of lighter areas in the background. Again, we're going to be on the back, so don't worry about the front. And generally, colors on the back are lighter than on the front, so even if you have a really dark fabric on the front, a lot of times the back will be a lot lighter. So what I did was, this is just a fat quarter. I went ahead and ironed it, and I sprayed it with a little bit of starch. And the reason why I wanted to starch it was because that kind of helps hold it a little bit together, and there's a little bit less fraying depending on how heavy you starch. But since we're going to be handling these a lot while we're hand sewing them, it's a little bit better to have that starched start so that you don't fray it too much while you're sewing it. And maybe you can kind of see, let me zoom in a little bit. Oops, wrong way. I've already started stamping on this, and what you want to do is test your inks first. You don't have to stamp the whole thing, maybe just stamp a little corner of it on the darkest parts to make sure that you can see this. So I have already stamped this before, and you can actually use something that kind of matches your fabric. So a purple on the purple fabric, or you can just go something like a brown. This is Acorn, and that will also work on a darker fabric. So of course, what we're going to do is just ink up our stamp, and I like to bring the stamp pad to the stamp, and I'm just going to tap it lightly. You don't need to smash it in there because you don't want too much ink on those lines. The lines are very fine to help you with cutting, and so you don't want to make them all dark and smushy. And then I'm going to place it exactly where I want it. I'm just going to press firmly, but again, I'm not smashing it down as hard as I can because I don't want to smash out those lines and make them fatter. And there you go. That's your image, and you can see that this brown even shows up against those dark purples, and so it makes the cutting line, which is the solid line on the outside, and then the dashed line on the inside is your stitching line. Okay, so that was stamping with the acrylic block, and now we're going to move to stamping with the MISTI. And if you're not familiar with the MISTI or stamp positioners in general, how they work is they make it so that you can actually stamp 2 or 3 or as many times as you want in the exact same place, which makes it really handy for big stamps like these ones, because, well, actually for a couple of reasons it's really handy. Excuse me. So what we're going to do is, remember how I told you to stamp the image down on a piece of paper, and so that's going to tell me where exactly the stamp is going to land, and I'm going to line up my fabric, making sure I'm covering all of that stamped image, and I'm just going to put the rest of the fabric out of the way. And then I'm going to take my ink, and again I'm using the dark brown Acorn, and I'm just going to tap lightly, and then I'm going to close the lid, making sure the fabric is still where it's supposed to be, and then I'm going to press down. Remember, not too hard. You don't want to smush it. And there's your stamped image. And actually, I didn't hold this down well enough, so I'm not going to be able to stamp again in the same place. But let me try do that again to show you how this works if you do it correctly. So I'm going to actually use a couple of magnets to hold my fabric down there, and that should keep it in place so it doesn't move. And again, I'm going to tap my ink all over my stamp, and then close the lid and press down. And you can see that it did stamp. Maybe it's a little bit harder to see in some areas, and that might be because I didn't have enough ink on my stamp, or just because the ink is not dark enough for those areas. But what I can do is just re-ink that stamp and stamp it again. And that makes it a little bit darker. And if I still think, well, you know, I really can't see those stitching lines there, let me zoom in. I'm still having a hard time seeing those stitching lines. I can actually go back in and take my jet black just on that top portion, because I don't need it for the whole thing. And I can actually just re-stamp that top portion of the stamp. And now I can see it better. So that's the great thing about stamping with the MISTI, is that you can actually test your inks out first. Maybe you want to start with a lighter ink and just make sure that your fabric is held down well enough that it's not going to move. The other alternative is that you can pre-cut your fabric. What you can do is actually make a template of the stamp just by stamping it out on a piece of paper or cardstock and cut it out, and then you can put it down on your fabric and cut just outside of the edges of the stamp line, and then line it up over that stamped image on the paper, and then stamp it down, and then you don't have to worry about how this outside fabric is going to affect the part that's being held down. So what you can do is actually stamp with a lighter color of ink, and then if it doesn't show up well, you can stamp with a darker color of ink, or like I just did here, you can stamp just portions with the darker color of ink. So that's just great. Okay, so this is what I meant when I said earlier about making a template out of paper or cardstock. You can actually use clear plastic. This is just a sheet of plastic report covers or something that I got from Amazon, and I just stamped on it with my same archival inks and let it dry, and then I cut on the cutting line, and you can still see the sewing lines. And so what this serves as is a guide for cutting your fabric in a couple of ways. You can just put it onto your fabric and then cut around it. You don't have to cut exactly around it, but cut around it, and then you can put it on your MISTI or just on your work surface to stamp on. But then with these stitching lines shown here, you can see this whole area inside of the stitching lines is what's going to show. So if you want to fussy cut, you can actually line up the lines around certain parts of the printed pattern that you might want as your front piece, and then you can actually trace around this template with a pen or pencil and then cut it out exactly. And then what you can do after that is line it up with your MISTI, with your stamp in your MISTI, and then you can stamp in the sewing lines. Of course, if you don't have these stamps, or if you don't have certain shapes that you're wanting to make pieces of, you could always just draw your own. I would start with a shape that I want and then trace that shape and then add my 1/4 inch seam allowance and draw out my cutting lines from that shape. So that's also something you can do. If you cut out your fabric exactly using the template, you could always just draw your 1/4 inch seam inside of those cut lines, and that'll be the same thing as if you stamped it. Okay, and just to be really clear, why don't I show you what I'm talking about? Let's not do the fussy cutting now because that's a little bit advanced, but what we can do is I'm just going to show you when you want to cut out a piece of fabric to put into your MISTI. You want to put the template over like that, and I'm making sure not to move my template so that I don't so that I make sure I cut out enough fabric. So let's see, yeah, that's enough. And then I'm going to just cut on the outside of that line. And there is my piece of fabric. And I can put the template to the side. And now remember, I'm stamping on the back. So I'm going to want to line that piece of fabric up over the drawn, okay, and it's down there. And then let me just make sure where everything is. And I'm going to put my magnet on one side over here, and then actually maybe up here on the top, because that tip is a little bit out of the way. And what I want to make sure is just that my fabric is not going to move when I stamp it. Just in case it doesn't stamp absolutely perfectly the first time, I want to make sure that I can go in there and stamp it again. So let me just take my Acorn ink, and again I'm just tapping lightly. And the reason why I go around a couple times is because I am tapping lightly, so I just want to make sure that everything is getting inked, but I don't want to smash my ink pad down and smash the ink onto the sides of the lines and have it print onto my fabric like that. And then you can actually see, before I put it all the way down, you can see that it's within that piece of fabric. And so I'm going to go ahead and press down. And there we go, we have the perfect image. Although this tip, maybe because the magnet is there, looks a little bit lighter, so I can go ahead and just press a little bit extra on that tip. And actually that's fine, you can see it. So let me get into the cutting portion now. Now of course you can just cut this out with scissors. You're just going to make sure you're cutting straight on those lines, the solid lines, the cutting lines. And I would recommend a bigger scissor than a smaller one, so that you're not making a bunch of tiny choppy cuts. You're making just kind of long, nice strokes, and that'll help keep it a little bit straighter. Of course, you can also cut with a ruler and your rotary tool. Just like that. And you're going to cut it right on that line. And I'm trying to be careful with this just because I want it to be kind of perfect. I said before, it doesn't have to be perfect, But it's easier once you start stitching to have the outside edges the same distance from the stitching line, because you're going to line up the points on the stitching line. And I'm going to go over that in the next video, which is going to be all about stitching your shapes together. So thank you very much for watching, and I hope you'll tune in next time, and I'll see you later.